Hi everybody, Paul here again. In this video, I'm going to show how to easily and accurately add refrigerant to the air conditioner system of a vehicle, along with some other important information. So stay tuned. And of course, as always, I'll have my assistant Sparky helping me. Isn't that right, buddy? The first thing that I want to say is as a vehicle ages, it will naturally lose a little refrigerant each year. So if you keep a vehicle long enough, eventually it will stop blowing cold air due to low refrigerant. In fact, the #1 cause of an air conditioner not blowing cold air is due to low refrigerant. If you do have low refrigerant and add more refrigerant and it starts blowing cold air again, but within a week, a month, or even a year, it stops blowing cold air again, then more than likely it has a refrigerant leak, which you may need to have fixed before adding more refrigerant. However, in some cases, if it's a slow leak, it may be more cost prohibitive just to occasionally add more refrigerant when it needs it, rather than paying to have it fixed. If you think you have a refrigerant leak, the very first thing that you should check are the Schrader valves inside the service ports. I'd say that as much as 80% of the refrigerant leaks that occur on a vehicle are due to a faulty Schrader valve. These are extremely easy and inexpensive to replace, and it's something that anybody can do. If you're interested in learning more on how to test and replace a Schrader valve, you can find how to do that in the description. In order for refrigerant to cool a vehicle, it must circulate under constant pressure and continually change back and forth from a gas to a liquid. It does this with both a low pressure side and a high pressure side. The low pressure side is made up of large lines like you see here. The high pressure side is made up of small lines like you see here. As the ambient air temperature and relative humidity rise, the pressure in the system will also rise. It normally takes 25 to 30 psi on the low pressure side for the compressor clutch to turn and circulate refrigerant. To properly add refrigerant, the ambient air temperature should be at least 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius or warmer in order for the system to build up enough pressure to operate. This is why it's recommended not to add refrigerant when it's cold outside. When the air conditioner is called upon to cool the vehicle, the clutch, located here on the outside of the compressor pulley wheel, will start turning to circulate refrigerant. If the clutch does not turn, then it cannot cool the vehicle. The clutch will always be located on the front of the engine by the drive belt. If the air conditioner system does not have enough refrigerant, or if it has too much refrigerant, then the clutch will not turn. One big caveat is there are many different things that can cause the clutch not to turn. If you're interested in learning more about what those things could be, then watch the next video at the end of this video. The main components that the refrigerant circulates through is a compressor, condenser, dryer, expansion valve or orifice tube, and an evaporator. The refrigerant starts by leaving the compressor as a high-pressure gas. The refrigerant then leaves the condenser as a high-pressure liquid. The refrigerant then leaves the expansion valve or orifice tube as a low-pressure liquid. The refrigerant then leaves the evaporator as a low-pressure gas and returns to the compressor. Refrigerant is always added to the low-pressure side, which has a smaller size fitting like you see here. This removable cap is marked with an L for low pressure. It's never added to the high pressure side, which has a larger size fitting like you see here. This removable cap is marked with an H for high pressure. There are basically two different ways to add refrigerant. The first and most accurate way is to first remove all of the refrigerant from the system and then add the required amount of refrigerant by weight for your specific vehicle back into the system. I like using this system the most because there's no guesswork involved. This will require a small, inexpensive food scale and a delivery system. The best delivery system is a manifold pressure gauge set with a sight glass like you see here. The sight glass allows you to visually observe the refrigerant while it's being added so that you do not overfeed the refrigerant into the system as a liquid, which is really important. Be sure the manifold pressure gauge set that you use is compatible with the refrigerant used in your specific vehicle. If you do not have a manifold pressure gauge set, a lot of auto parts stores will loan these out with a full refund once it's returned. This particular manifold pressure gauge set is from Harbor Freight. It gets really high reviews and it sells for only $65. I'll post this in the description. Be advised that refrigerant should not be released into the atmosphere. The easiest way to remove the refrigerant is to take the vehicle to an auto repair facility that has a special refrigerant recovery machine, which will also apply a vacuum to the system. Getting a price quote from at least 3 different places will help you get the best price. Now I'm going to show how to add the refrigerant. All of the refrigerant has been removed from this particular vehicle, so I'm going to add the required amount of refrigerant by weight back into the system. In order to add refrigerant by weight, first locate the label, which will usually be located somewhere towards the front of the engine compartment. A lot of times, it'll be located somewhere in this area or somewhere on the hood in this area. The label in this particular vehicle is located by the hood release. This will show what type of refrigerant and how much the system holds. As you can see in this particular vehicle, it uses 134A and holds a minimum to maximum amount of 500 to 600 grams. It also gives the minimum to maximum amount in pounds. I always use grams because it's a much easier system to use and because it's a smaller, more accurate unit of measurement. Most do-it-yourselfers adding automotive refrigerant will use these small cans, which you can purchase at any auto parts store. Sometimes you can even find these at big box stores or even grocery stores. Be sure to use cans that only contain pure refrigerant. Do not use cans that contain additional oil or stop leak. As you can see on the can, it has a net weight of 12 ounces or 340 grams. This means the can contains 12 ounces or 340 grams of refrigerant by weight. When adding refrigerant, always be sure to observe all safety precautions. If refrigerant gets into your eye, it can freeze your eyeball, causing permanent damage or blindness, so always wear eye protection. It can also cause frostbite to your skin, so always wear gloves. Again, this particular vehicle holds a minimum to maximum amount of 500 to 600 grams of refrigerant. I always add the maximum amount because you can never completely empty a can of refrigerant, and because of the refrigerant left in the service hoses used to add the refrigerant. To accomplish this, I'll need 3 cans of refrigerant. The first can will total 340 grams, so I'll need an additional 260 grams from the second can, which will total 600 grams. I'll also use a third can for purging, which I'll show how to do. Next, hang the manifold pressure gauge set and close both valves. Do not over-tighten the valves or you may damage them. Both gauges should also read 0. If you need to read 0 either of the needles, remove the cap on the front of the gauge and adjust it. Most manifold pressure gauge sets will be color-coded. The low pressure gauge will be blue and the high pressure gauge will be red. Be sure to use the most outer numbers on the gauges to read the pressure, which will be in PSI, which stands for pounds per square inch. Next, attach the blue low pressure hose to the low pressure side port. Attach the red high pressure hose to the high pressure side port. Attach the yellow service hose to the middle service port. Make sure these hose fittings and all the other hose fittings are snugged down properly to avoid any leaks. Do not tighten any of the hose fittings with any kind of a tool. Just turn it until it stops and then snug it just a little. Let the seals do their work. Next, take the refrigerant can adapter valve and turn it to the fully closed position until the internal metal stem retracts all the way back in and stops. I also purchased this at Harbor Freight, which I'll post in the description. Next, attach the other end of the yellow service hose to the refrigerant can adapter valve. Next, screw the refrigerant can onto the refrigerant can adapter valve and snug it down hand tight. Next, open the manifold pressure gauge low pressure side valve. With the can facing upward and the blue low pressure hose facing away from you, open the refrigerant can adapter valve, let the refrigerant gas purge out for a few seconds and then close it. This will purge the air and moisture out of the yellow service hose, the manifold pressure gauge, and the blue low pressure side hose so that it does not enter the air conditioner system. One huge caveat is always keep the manifold pressure gauge high pressure side valve in the closed position during this entire procedure. If you open the high pressure side valve, you may damage the air conditioner system. Next, attach the blue coupler valve to the blue low pressure hose. Attach the red coupler valve to the red high pressure hose. Next, remove the low pressure side service port cap. Next, turn the blue low pressure coupler valve to the fully closed position until the internal metal stem retracts all the way back in and stops. Now attach it to the low pressure side service port. Pull back on the coupler, slide it on until it stops, and release the coupler. Pull on the coupler valve to make sure it's locked on. The low pressure coupler valve will only fit on the low pressure side service port. Next, gently open the coupler valve until it stops. Do not snug it down tight or you may bend the Schrader valve. Next, remove the high pressure side service port cap. Next, turn the red high pressure coupler valve to the fully closed position until the internal metal stem retracts all the way back in and stops. Now attach it to the high pressure side service port. Again, pull back on the coupler, slide it on until it stops, and release the coupler. Pull on the coupler valve to make sure it's locked on. The high pressure coupler valve will only fit on the high pressure side service port. Again, gently open the coupler valve until it stops. Do not snug it down tight or you may bend the Schrader valve. When adding refrigerant, be sure to keep the manifold pressure gauge and hoses away from moving engine parts and hot surfaces, otherwise they may be damaged. When adding the main contents of the can, never continually hold the can upside down, which can slug liquid refrigerant into the compressor. Liquid cannot be compressed, so you can damage the compressor. The proper way to add refrigerant is to first shake the can. Next, hold the can upside down and very slowly open the refrigerant can adapter valve. Once you see liquid refrigerant pass through the sight glass on the manifold pressure gauge, do not open the adapter valve any further. Next, start rotating the can between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock while occasionally shaking the can. Continue this process until the can feels empty, then turn the can upside down for 1 minute to dispense the remaining refrigerant. Continue this process until the correct amount of refrigerant is added. There are many variables that determine how long it can take to empty one 12-ounce can of refrigerant, but normally it will take 5 to 15 minutes. Once everything is set up to add refrigerant, start the vehicle. Lower all the windows to the fully open position. Insert a thermometer probe into the left center air vent. If the air vent has any kind of manual adjustment to open or close it, make sure it's in the fully open position. Once the engine reaches normal operating temperature, turn the blower speed on low, turn on the air conditioner, set it to maximum cold, turn the airflow selector to the vent position, and turn the air recirculation to the on position. When performing this, the vehicle should not be in direct sunlight. Again, the ambient air temperature should be at or above 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius or warmer. However, if it's going to be a really hot day, do not add refrigerant during the heat of the day. Instead, add it in the morning or in the evening when it's cooler. It's now been about 15 minutes and the can feels empty, so I'll leave it upside down for 1 minute. Once the can is empty, turn the adapter valve to the fully closed position until the internal metal stem retracts all the way back in and stops. Now close the manifold pressure gauge low pressure side valve. Now unscrew the empty can. Attach the second can. Now open the manifold pressure gauge low pressure side valve. Again, turn the can upside down and very slowly open the adapter valve. Once you see liquid refrigerant passing through the sight glass, do not open the adapter valve any further and continue adding refrigerant. I'll need to add 260 more grams of refrigerant from the second can, so I'll continue adding and weighing the can until it weighs approximately 260 grams less. Do not perform this with the scale sitting on the vehicle. The can now weighs approximately 260 grams less, so I'm done adding refrigerant. The thermometer probe shows 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is good. A vehicle's air conditioner operates at maximum efficiency when it's being driven, so I'll check the temperature again the next time I take it for a drive. I like this particular thermometer probe because it has a large, easy-to-read dial, and unlike digital ones, it requires no batteries. It also has a clip on the probe to fasten it to air vent louvers to hold it in place. I'll post this in the description. If the temperature on the thermometer probe remains higher than what's shown on a refrigerant performance chart for your specific refrigerant while driving, then the air conditioner is not cooling the way that it should and will require additional service. With the engine still running, close and remove the low pressure coupler valve. With the engine still running, close and remove the high pressure coupler valve. Now you can turn off the engine. Now that the recharging is completed, be sure to reset the Schrader valve on both the low pressure side and on the high pressure side by quickly pressing straight down on the valve stem and releasing it. This will prevent refrigerant leakage at the Schrader valve, which commonly occurs after recharging the system. When you perform this, use a round flathead punch. Now reinstall the low pressure side and the high pressure side caps and you're done. The second way to add refrigerant is by adding it back into a system that already contains refrigerant. In order to do this, you'll perform everything exactly the same way that I just showed, but instead of adding refrigerant by weight, you'll be relying completely on the manifold pressure gauge and thermometer probe while adding refrigerant. The pressure reading between the low pressure side and the high pressure side will vary greatly. In order to do this with as much accuracy as possible, it must be done in direct relationship to the ambient air temperature and relative humidity by using a refrigerant performance chart. This performance chart is for R134A, which is the most common refrigerant used today. One huge caveat is before using a refrigerant performance chart, you first need to know if your air conditioner system uses an orifice tube or an expansion valve. If it uses an orifice tube, then you can use a refrigerant performance chart. However, if it uses an expansion valve, the refrigerant performance chart pressures will not apply and the refrigerant must be added by weight. So if you have an orifice tube, slowly add the refrigerant until it's within the low and high pressure range shown on the refrigerant performance chart based on the existing ambient air temperature and relative humidity. Always remember that less pressure is better than more pressure. The biggest mistake that people make when adding refrigerant is they add too much, causing higher pressures. When adding refrigerant, the manifold pressure gauge needs to be read while running a fan in front of the vehicle and keeping the engine at 2,000 RPMs. This will move air across the front of the AC condenser and simulate the vehicle being driven. If you do not do this, both manifold pressure gauges will read higher than normal, particularly on the high pressure side. This chart will also help to interpret the pressure readings for any potential problems and how to fix them. If the low and high pressure gauges are in range, the AC is working properly. If the low and high pressure gauges are low, add refrigerant. If the low pressure gauge is low and the high pressure gauge is high, there could be possible blockage of the expansion valve or orifice tube. If the low pressure gauge is high and the high pressure gauge is low, it could possibly be a faulty compressor. If the low and high pressure gauges are high, the system is overcharged, requiring slow removal of the refrigerant. In addition to closely watching the pressures on the manifold pressure gauge while adding refrigerant, you must also closely watch the thermometer probe. Depending on how low the refrigerant is, once you start adding refrigerant, the air coming out of the vent will normally go from hot to warm to cold to very cold, at which point you should not add any more refrigerant. Even if the manifold pressure gauge says to add more refrigerant, don't do it. If you add too much, which doesn't take much, the temperature will go from very cold to warm or even hot. You have to remember that adding refrigerant is not an exact science and it takes patience. In closing, here's some other valuable information that I want to share. The fittings on the manifold pressure gauge set on the outer left, in the middle, and on the outer right are for storing the hoses and keeping the fittings clean if you do not store it in a case. That's all they're for. Refrigerant cans in the past required puncturing a hole in the top of the can. This was done with an adapter valve that had a piercing style stem like you see here. However, refrigerant cans today now use a self-sealing valve which requires an adapter valve that has a flat style stem like you see here. Be advised that if you use an adapter valve that has a piercing style stem on a self-sealing can, it will not release the refrigerant. If your vehicle has a cabin air filter and it's dirty, this will restrict the airflow coming out of the vents and affect the cooling. Be sure to check the cabin air filter, which will usually be located on the front passenger side behind the glove box, and replace it if it's dirty. This one needs to be replaced. You can learn how to do this in the description. Whenever you use the air conditioner, always turn on the air recirculation. This will keep the passenger compartment the most comfortable. It also means the air conditioner will not have to work as hard, which will cause less wear on the air conditioner system. Also remember, when the air conditioner is being used, it's normal for water to leak underneath the vehicle. This is due to condensation that occurs from the evaporator located inside the dashboard. However, sometimes the drain hose can become blocked. If this happens, not only will it prevent the air conditioner from cooling, but the floor will also become wet. Unblocking the drain hose is usually pretty easy to do, which you can learn how to do in the description. I hope you found this helpful, and if you like this video, please hit the like button below, share it with your friends, and please be sure to subscribe. God bless you and have a great day. Bye for now. And while you guys are working on your car, I'll be working on a tan on this beautiful white sandy beach.